Hello, we're going to continue our discussion of developmental psychology today, starting with Piaget's theory of cognitive development. You may recall that we already indicated that one of the areas of interest to developmental psychologists is cognition, the way we think about things. And Jean Piaget, who was a Swiss psychologist in the 20th century, made significant contributions to an understanding of cognitive development in, through through his studies of children and adolescents, and how he was able to help us gain a better understanding of how the ways in which children change as they grow up. It's not just that they know more or come to know more, but also that the way they think about things changes. Piaget believed that this process occurred as a child is interacting with the world around them, and that with increasing experience with that world, the child develops what Piaget called schema. A schema is an organized pattern of thought and behavior that helps the child to understand how to interact more effectively with the world. Not only do children have schema, but so do we. We have organized patterns of thought and behavior that help us throughout every day. A simple example would be a schema about how to eat breakfast, or how to drive a car, how to take notes in a classroom, how to study for a test. The list goes on and on and on. But of course, a young child hasn't had that much life experience yet, so they're continually expanding on the schema they already have and adding new schema through experience. Children do this through a process of assimilation and accommodation. When a child has a new experience, the first thing they do is try to incorporate it into an already existing schema. And if that works, fine. But if it doesn't, if the new experience is different enough, then they may have to alter their schema or create an entirely new one to incorporate this new experience. And when that happens, they do so through the process of accommodation. Let's take, for example, a very small child, a young child, who has a kitty cat at home, and the child's experience with animals is still quite limited, to where whenever the child sees any furry animal with a long tail that bears any resemblance at all to her kitty cat, she calls it a kitty cat. That would include squirrels, for example. She sees them playing in the yard and she calls them kitty cats. But then one day she encounters a skunk. And a skunk is different enough from the kitty cat. It looks different, it acts different, it smells different, that it makes for an interesting challenge for the child to figure out where to fit this new experience, this new creature, into the child's existing schema. And the child ends up having to expand her schema to take in other furry animals that are not kitty cats, and learns then about a skunk and about squirrels and many other animals. But at first, to that child, they are all kitty cats. So when the child is able to alter uh, her schema or create an entirely new one, then she is engaged in the process of accommodation, where she is now able to adapt to this new experience, remember it, so the next time she sees a skunk, she'll know what it is and how it fits into her schema. So for Piaget, he talked about how children go through different stages of cognitive development. And the very first stage is what he called the sensory motor stage. It occurs during the first 2 years of life. And during this time, the child is primarily interacting with the world around him through the use of his senses. One interesting occurrence during the sensory motor stage is the emergence of object permanence. Early on, a child doesn't really know that something exists when he can't see it anymore. But when the child develops object permanence, which according to Piaget is somewhere between 8 months and a year of age, the child now knows that things exist even when they can't see them anymore. As we can see in this picture, where this child is playing with a little stuffed animal. It's covered, and the child looks for it under the covering and pulls the covering off, and voila, there's the little animal. So we can see this child is gaining object permanence. Object permanence turns out to be a pretty big deal because it provides sort of the basis for the child eventually to be able to learn language, which Piaget called symbolic thought or symbolic capacity. So how is object permanence related to language? Well, for us to be able to learn words that stand for things, it helps if we appreciate that these things exist independent of our immediate experiencing of them. If I were to say the word bullfrog to you, you could picture in your mind what a bullfrog looks like, what it sounds like, even though the bullfrog is not in your immediate presence. You can probably spell the word bullfrog. You can picture in your mind the letters that make up the word. All of these things, which we eventually can do, as we're developing. A very young child is not capable of that yet. But once they develop object permanence, it opens the door for them to begin to develop language in that way. Another area where object permanence is important has to do with separation anxiety, which is a very important developmental process for children to go through. You might wonder, well, why is that important? Let's think about that for a moment. Every child goes through a phase of separation anxiety where they feel uncomfortable when they're separated from their parents. And those children who are securely attached to their parents adapt to this awareness very well. And when their parents return, they're comforted by their presence and they learn how to adjust to being away from their parents. Well, for this to be possible, they need to have an understanding that their parents exist independent of their immediate experiencing of them. So they know their parent is out there somewhere, even when they're not with them. And while it does cause them some distress, maybe to be separated from their parent, at least for a little while, uh, they usually get over that and they're again comforted when their parents return. If you've ever worked as a nurse in a nursery of a church with little kids, and seeing the different ways in which they react when they're separated from their parents, you know exactly what we're talking about here. In Piaget's second stage of development, the pre-operational stage, one of the things that Piaget observed during this stage, which occurs from about age 2 to age 7, is that children lack the ability to think logically about things yet. And he had an ingenious way in which he demonstrated this through the use of conservation tasks, where he would alter the appearance of something, some substance like, say, water or clay, and he would ask the child if the amount changed. And the child thought the amount changed even when it didn't, even when the only thing that changed was the configuration or um, the way in which the substance was presented to the child. Here we see an example of that. We'll go back to that last slide in just a moment, where this little girl is presented with two sort of short, fat glasses with milk in them. And then one of these glasses is poured into a tall, skinny glass. And the child is then asked, now, do the two glasses have the same amount of milk or are they different? And the child says the tall, skinny glass has more milk, even though the child saw the adult pour the short, fat glass into the tall, skinny glass when the same amount of milk was present before. So Piaget would say this child lacks conservation. They don't understand that the amount of something can remain the same even when the shape of it changes. So this was a way in which he showed us that the manner in which the child is thinking is causing them to respond in this way. They're not able to think logically. They're not able to focus on more than one aspect of the situation at a time. They're not able to play it back in their mind and forward again, all of which would be aspects of logical thinking in this situation. When children get a little older, around the age of 7 or 8 or so, when they move into the next stage of Piaget's stages of development, the concrete operation stage, they are able to solve the conservation problem. Piaget also saw the emergence of imagination during this time, where children engage in more pretend play, and where they can think in terms of symbols and say, imagine a brush being a microphone and singing into it, that sort of thing. In addition, they demonstrated what he called egocentrism, which was the child's inability to understand things from the perspective or point of view of other people. The child assumes that everybody looks at things the same way the child looks at things. Here would be an example of that. A little girl is out playing in the yard in the summertime, and she finds a frog. She catches the frog and she puts it in a shoebox, and she pokes holes in the shoebox and puts grass in there for the frog. She's never caught a frog before, and she's very excited about this. It's a really big deal to her. Well, it just so happens that on this day that she catches the frog, it's also her mother's birthday, and she gets this idea. This frog is about the coolest thing I've ever had. I want to give it to my mother. So she gives it to her mother for her birthday. Happy birthday, Mommy. She gives her mother the box with a frog in it, thinking her mother is going to be as excited and delighted about the frog as she is, thinking that her mom's going to think about it the same way she thinks about it. Looking at this chart, we can, in addition to taking a look at the two stages of Piaget's theory we've already talked about, we can see his other two stages, the concrete operational stage and the formal operational stage. In the concrete operational stage, children develop the ability to think logically, and they can solve problems, but their thinking is still anchored in the physical world. They're not able to think in an abstract way very well yet. If you were to ask a child in the concrete operational stage to describe herself, she might say things like, I have freckles, I have red hair, I can run fast. These are physical aspects of her being. But when children get into the formal operational stage, they develop the ability to think abstractly, to think in terms of theories and hypotheses and that sort of thing. They become more interesting conversationalists in that way because they're able to think abstractly. And they also become better able uh, to form their own points of view about things and to express them more effectively, even becoming argumentative at times. But this reflects growth in their ability to think in a more abstract way. If you were to ask a child in the formal operational stage to describe herself, she might say something like, I'm shy or I'm liberal, using more abstract words to characterize herself. So this concludes our overview of Piaget's theory. It's a fascinating theory for me. I always enjoy talking about it. We've only given it a cursory going over today, but it at least introduces you to some of his ideas. You can see that Piaget's theory is a stage theory because he has these 4 stages that he says children go through as they're developing cognitively. That's as far as he really took things through adolescence. Other people have expanded on his theory since then to incorporate more changes in cognitive ability beyond adolescence. But his theory has been very important in the fields, continues to be important in the fields of education and psychology, and has generated many thousands of studies. I've enjoyed talking with you about it today, and I look forward to talking with you further about some more topics in developmental psychology soon.